The door of the farmhouse swung open before she even reached the steps, and a man stood there silhouetted against the lamplight. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and in his hands he held a shotgun. The barrel was pointed right at her heart. "Who are you?" His voice cut through the raging storm, cold as winter iron. Clara Sullivan stood frozen on the porch, clutching her 6-year-old daughter May. Rain and wind tore at her thin shawl. This was supposed to be a sanctuary, the last stop on a desperate flight across the country. But the man in the doorway looked less like a savior and more like an executioner. This was Thornfield Farm, her last hope, and it was about to become her worst nightmare. She tried to straighten up, to look braver than she felt, blinking rain from her eyes. "I'm the woman Reverend Peterson sent," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "to care for your mother." Lightning split the Nebraska sky, illuminating them both for a split second. The man, Ethan Thornfield, had a face that might have once been handsome, but grief had carved it into a hard mask. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over her, then down to the small, shivering child in her arms. They lingered on May's face for a moment too long. "You're 2 days early," he said. The suspicion in his voice was a physical thing, and the Reverend said nothing about a child. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. The wagon that brought them here was already a faint shadow disappearing down the muddy track. The nearest town was miles away, an impossible walk in this storm. They were trapped. "The stagecoach schedule changed," she stammered. "As for my daughter, I couldn't leave her behind." She thought he was going to send them away, to leave them to the mercy of the prairie storm, which would surely be no mercy at all. His gaze shifted back to May, huddled against her mother, rainwater dripping from her pale face. Something in his harsh expression seemed to crack, just for a second. "You're here only to care for my mother," he said, finally stepping aside. Nothing more. It wasn't a welcome, but it wasn't a refusal. Relief made Clara's knees weak. "Yes, sir," she whispered, and hurried them inside, out of the storm's fury. They stepped into the warmth of the farmhouse, water pooling around their boots on the wooden floor. The house smelled of wood smoke and something else. Something faintly medicinal, sharp and unsettling. The furniture was simple, practical, as if the house had forgotten how to be a home. "Your room's off the kitchen," Ethan said, shutting the door against the howl of the wind. "Don't make noise after dark. Mother sleeps poorly." He didn't offer to help with their single, heavy bag. He just turned and strode down the hallway, the shotgun still held ready in the crook of his arm. As he passed a long, dark hallway to the west, Clara noticed every door was closed, but one, at the very end, looked different. It had a heavy, newer-looking lock on the outside. Why would a door inside a farmhouse need a lock on the outside? Ethan stopped at the top of the stairs. "Mother's room is upstairs," he said without turning around. "You'll meet her in the morning." "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield," Clara called after him. He didn't reply. The small bedroom was plain, but clean. A narrow iron bed, a chest of drawers, and a single window facing east. Clara set their bag down and helped May out of her wet clothes, wrapping her in a dry quilt from the bed. "We'll be safe here," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as her daughter. But as she looked around the small bare room, she noticed something else that sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The window. It was nailed shut. She ran her fingers over the rusted nail heads, driven deep into the wood of the sash. It wasn't an old repair. These were new nails. They weren't just being given shelter. They were being contained. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a prison. When May was finally asleep, Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. The shotgun, the suspicion, the lock on the outside of that mysterious door, the window nailed shut. Nothing about this place felt right. Reverend Peterson had described Thornfield Farm as a place of quiet refuge, and Ethan as a good man shattered by grief. But this felt like something else entirely, something dangerous. She pressed her fingers against her eyes, trying to hold back the tears. They had run so far, given up everything, only to land in a new kind of trap. For tonight, it was shelter. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they couldn't stay. They would have to run again. Morning broke clear and cold. Clara rose before dawn, dressing in her one good dress, a serviceable navy blue that had seen better days. In the kitchen, she found a pot of coffee already made and bread cooling on the counter. There was no sign of Ethan, though his muddy boots were gone from by the door. He was out there somewhere, on the vast empty prairie. May appeared in the doorway, clutching her one-armed cloth doll. Clara knelt and buttoned her collar, her heart aching at her daughter's silence. May hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since her father's death, as if she was afraid her voice might attract a danger they couldn't afford. "Good morning." Clara spun around. An older woman stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane. She was thin as a winter reed, with silver hair pulled back in a simple knot. But her eyes were sharp and clear, and they took in every detail of Clara and May with an unnerving intensity. This had to be Eleanor Thornfield. "Mrs. Thornfield," Clara said, dropping into a small curtsy. "I'm Clara Sullivan." "I know who you are," Eleanor interrupted, her voice surprisingly strong. "Ethan told me you'd arrived, and this must be the child." May hid behind Clara's skirts, but Eleanor's gaze was fixed on her. The old woman's eyes weren't just observing, they were searching for something. "Her name is May," Clara said. "She won't be any trouble." "Children are supposed to be trouble," Eleanor said, a strange, knowing look on her face. "That's how we know they're alive." She moved slowly to the table and sank into a chair. She didn't look at Clara. She looked at the wall behind her, as if expecting to see someone else there. "You have widow's eyes," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Yes, ma'am. My husband passed last winter." Eleanor nodded, as if this confirmed something. She gestured toward the stove. "Pour me some coffee, child. Then tell me why you're really here." The question hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. Clara's hands trembled as she poured the coffee. This wasn't the gentle, frail invalid she had been hired to care for. This was a woman who saw through lies. "Reverend Peterson arranged—" "The Reverend arranges many things," Eleanor cut her off, "but he doesn't know everything." She took the coffee cup, her eyes still fixed on Clara. "He told me you were from Chicago, but your accent is Philadelphia, born and raised." Clara froze. How could she possibly know that? "And your dress," Eleanor continued, her gaze dropping to the simple navy fabric. "Serviceable, yes, but it was made by a good tailor. The kind of tailor a simple housekeeper from Chicago could never afford. You're running from something. Something more than just grief." Clara didn't know what to say. Every instinct screamed at her to lie, to maintain her cover story. But looking into Eleanor's piercing eyes, she knew it would be useless. Then, as Clara stood there speechless, she saw it. As Eleanor reached for her coffee, the collar of her dress shifted slightly, and on her shoulder, just visible for a second, was a scar. It was small but distinctive, a tattoo-like mark in the shape of a flower with 5 petals. Clara's blood ran cold. She had seen that exact same mark before, in the exact same place, on her own mother. Clara's hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her mother, Margaret, had been a proper Boston lady. She had never spoken of the war, except in vague terms about nursing soldiers. And she had certainly never explained the strange, flower-shaped scar on her shoulder. When Clara had asked about it as a child, her mother had simply said it was a reminder of a promise. Eleanor saw the look on Clara's face. She saw where her eyes were fixed, and the old woman's entire demeanor changed. The suspicion vanished, replaced by an expression of intense, urgent recognition. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Your mother sent you, didn't she?" Clara could only stare, her mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. It was impossible. Her mother had been dead for 4 years. "My mother. She's gone," Clara whispered. Eleanor's sharp eyes searched her face. What was her name? Her maiden name? Margaret Hale. A long, shuddering breath escaped Eleanor's lips. She sagged back in her chair, her hand trembling as she set down her coffee cup. "Margaret Hale," she repeated, the name a ghost on her lips. "Of course. You have her eyes." She looked at Clara now, truly looked at her, and Clara felt as if the old woman was seeing generations of secrets. "The Reverend didn't send you here by chance, child. Nothing is by chance." "I don't understand," Clara said, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "The lavender circle," Eleanor said. her voice low and secretive. "Your mother was one of us, one of the first." The what? The name meant nothing to Clara. It sounded like a ladies' gardening club, but the look on Eleanor's face said it was something far more serious. "We helped women," Eleanor explained, her eyes darting toward the closed kitchen door, as if afraid of being overheard. "Women in difficult situations, women who needed to disappear. The mark on my shoulder, on your mother's shoulder, it identified us to each other. A sign of trust, a promise of sanctuary." Clara sank into a chair opposite her legs suddenly unable to hold her. Her mother, the epitome of propriety, had been part of a secret underground network? It seemed impossible, and yet it explained so much. The money her mother had secretly saved, the coded letters she sometimes received, the unexplained trips she would take. "This farmhouse," where Eleanor continued, "is one of the safe houses, one of the last stops for those heading west, where a woman can truly start over." So that was it. Reverend Peterson hadn't just found her a job. He had, following some long-forgotten instruction from her mother, sent her to the one place in the country she would be truly safe. But if this was a safe house, then what about Ethan? The shotgun, the suspicion, the window nailed shut in her room, and that heavy lock on the outside of the door in the west wing. None of it felt safe. "Your son," Clara began, choosing her words carefully. "He doesn't seem to know." Eleanor's face clouded over. "Ethan has his own ghosts. His wife, Sarah, died 3 years ago. In this house. He hasn't been the same since. He sees danger in every shadow. He doesn't know the full extent of my work. It was safer that way." She leaned forward again, her expression grave. "Which is why you must be careful. He trusts no one, especially not now." As if on cue, they heard heavy footsteps on the back porch. Ethan was returning. Eleanor put a finger to her lips. "Not a word of this to him," she whispered urgently. "Let me be the frail old woman you were hired to care for. And you be the simple widow. It's the only way this will work." The kitchen door opened, and Ethan stood there, his face as hard and unreadable as it had been the night before. His eyes flicked from his mother to Clara, a question in his gaze. "Mrs. Sullivan was just telling me about her journey," Eleanor said, her voice suddenly weak and thin, the transformation startling. Such a long way for a woman alone with a child. Ethan grunted in response, moving to the stove to pour himself a cup of coffee. He didn't look at Clara, but she could feel his presence filling the room, a silent, watchful weight. This was the man she had to live with, a man who didn't trust her, in a house full of secrets she was just beginning to unravel. Later that day, Clara was trying to air out her small room, struggling with the nails in the window frame, when she heard it. A sound from the west wing, a soft, muffled crying. She froze, her fingers still on the rusted nail head. It wasn't May, who was outside with Eleanor, helping to feed the chickens. It wasn't the wind, which had died down to a whisper. This was the sound of human grief, deep and wrenching, and it was coming from behind that locked door. Driven by a curiosity that overrode her fear, Clara crept out of her room and down the main hall, moving toward the west wing. The hallway was colder than the rest of the house, thick with dust and disuse. The crying grew louder as she approached the door at the very end of the hall, the one with the heavy external lock. She pressed her ear to the cold wood. It was a man's cry. Ethan's. "Is someone there?" she called softly, knocking lightly on the door. The crying stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. Clara was about to turn away, thinking she had imagined it, when Ethan's voice came from the other side, rough and cold as a tombstone. "What do you want?" Clara jumped back from the door, startled. I I heard crying. I thought someone might be hurt." "It was the wind," he said flatly. "Go back to the kitchen." It was a dismissal, sharp and final, but Clara knew what she had heard. It was grief, raw and familiar as her own. She turned away, but as she walked back down the hall, a chilling thought struck her. He wasn't just grieving in that room. He was hiding. The lock on the outside wasn't to keep people out. It was to make sure no one could see what was inside. That night at dinner, the silence was a crushing weight. Ethan wouldn't meet her eyes. He ate quickly and excused himself. As Clara was clearing the table, She noticed a piece of paper had fallen from his pocket. She picked it up. It was a list of supplies he needed from town. Medicines for Eleanor, feed for the livestock. But at the bottom, one item was circled, written in a more frantic hand. Laudanum, a powerful opiate, used for pain, but also highly addictive. Why would a simple farmer need laudanum? The next morning, Ethan found her on the porch at dawn. He looked as though he hadn't slept. Mother's medicines need refilling, he said, avoiding her eyes. He held out the list in a small leather pouch of coins. The wagon will take you to town this morning. Of course, she said, taking them. His fingers were calloused, a fresh cut across one knuckle. Working hands. Take the child if you wish, he added, as if it were an afterthought. Mother needs her rest. It was the first hint of consideration he'd shown, but as she turned to go, his voice stopped her. Mrs. Sullivan. Yes? Be careful in town, he said, his voice low. People talk. The warning was cryptic, but Clara understood. A young widow and her child living in a single man's home. It would invite gossip, and gossip could travel all the way back to Philadelphia, all the way back to the man she was running from, the man who wanted her dead. Clara took May with her to the town of Oak Ridge. The general store was run by a stout woman with shrewd eyes named Harriet Jenkins. You must be the new help for old Mrs. Thornfield, the woman said, her eyebrows rising slightly as Clara handed her the list. I'm Clara Sullivan. Harriet Jenkins, the woman replied, known the Thornfields for 30 years. Good people, if a bit solitary since Ethan lost his wife. Her eyes flicked to May. Terrible business, losing her and the baby both. Clara hadn't known about a baby. The loss was even deeper than she'd imagined. No wonder Ethan was so broken. As Mrs. Jenkins gathered the items, the bell above the door jingled. A man entered. A tall man in a well-cut city suit, his boots dusty from travel. Clara's heart stopped. For one terrifying second, she thought it was Josiah Blackwell, her brother-in-law, the man who had framed her for her husband's murder, the man who had been hunting her for months. It wasn't Josiah, but the man carried the same air of cold confidence. Good day, ma'am, he said to Mrs. Jenkins. I wonder if you might assist me. I'm looking for a woman who may have passed through here recently. A widow, with a young daughter. Clara spun away, grabbing May's shoulder and pulling her close. She pretended to examine a shelf of tin goods, her back to the counter, blood roaring in her ears. This woman would be quite memorable, the man's smooth voice continued. Refined, dark hair. The child would be about 6. They may have given a false name, but the woman's true name is Clara Blackwell. Blackwell, he was using her husband's name. Josiah had sent him. This was it. They were caught. Can't help you, I'm afraid, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice perfectly neutral. Her brother-in-law is concerned for her welfare, the man persisted. There are financial matters to resolve. Well, if I see anyone matching that description, where might I send word? Mrs. Jenkins asked. I'm staying at the hotel in Council Bluffs for the next week. The name's Fletcher. The bell jingled again as the man left. Clara remained frozen, staring blindly at the tins until Mrs. Jenkins came to her side. Your items are ready, Mrs. Sullivan, she said quietly. Clara turned, her face a carefully composed mask. Thank you. The older woman studied her for a long moment. Then as she wrapped the packages, she leaned in close. Thornfield Farm is quite isolated, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Not the sort of place a stranger would stumble upon by accident. She pressed a small, folded note into Clara's palm along with the package. Give this to Eleanor, she whispered. Tell her Harriet sent it. It wasn't just a promise of silence. It was a declaration of alliance. The wagon ride back to the farm was agony. Every rider on the horizon looked like Fletcher. When they arrived, Clara sent May to find Eleanor and sought out Ethan in the barn. There was a man in town, she said, her voice shaking as she relayed the story. He was sent by my brother-in-law, Josiah. He thinks I killed my husband. She finally told him the whole sordid tale, the fire, the insurance money, Josiah's lies. I wouldn't have brought this trouble to your door if I'd known, she finished, expecting him to tell her to leave. Ethan was silent for a long moment, brushing down a chestnut mare. Did Mrs. Jenkins tell this man anything? No, she seemed to understand. She gave me a note for your mother. A flicker of recognition crossed Ethan's face. He nodded slowly. Harriet Jenkins is mother's oldest friend. They worked together in the war. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. The man didn't follow you? No, I don't think so. Then you're safe enough. For now. The words were matter of fact, but they were the anchor Clara desperately needed. Thank you, she whispered. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. Mrs. Sullivan. Yes? I don't believe you killed your husband. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't acceptance. But it was belief. And after months of running, belief felt like a miracle. Clara found Eleanor in the parlor and gave her the note from Harriet. The old woman's face grew grim as she read it. He's closer than I thought, she said, her voice losing its frail quaver. She looked up at Clara, her eyes blazing with a fire Clara hadn't seen before. Josiah Blackwell is not just a greedy man. He's a dangerous one. He's not just looking for you, Clara. He's looking for something your husband had, something he thinks you have now. What are you talking about? I have nothing. Your husband, Thomas, Eleanor said, was not a good man, but he wasn't a fool. He knew his brother was stealing from their company. He kept a second set of books, a ledger, detailing all of Josiah's crimes. Josiah needs that ledger. Without it, his entire empire could collapse. Clara stared at her, stunned. A secret ledger. Thomas had never mentioned such a thing. He must think I took it when I fled, Clara whispered. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. And he will tear this country apart to find it, and to silence the one person who might know where it is. You. The danger was no longer just about a false accusation. It was about a secret that could destroy a powerful man, a secret he would kill to protect. That night, unable to sleep, Clara found herself drawn to the piano in the parlor. She began to play a soft Chopin nocturne that had always calmed her. The notes flowed through the silent house, a river of melancholy beauty. She was so absorbed, she didn't hear Ethan enter the room until he spoke. My wife played, he said, his voice startling her into a discordant note. Not as well as you, but she loved it. He sank into an armchair, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. In the lamplight, with his guard down, Clara could see the profound grief etched on his face. What was she like? Clara asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment. Sarah was. Light, he said finally. She found joy in small things. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She used to say I was too serious. His smile faded. We were expecting our first child, a son. His gaze drifted toward the west wing, toward the locked room. She died on a night like the one you arrived on, he continued, his voice thick with pain. The rain, the wind. She went into labor early. I rode for the doctor, but the creek was flooding. By the time we made it back, he swallowed hard. She was gone. The baby, too. He took a long drink from his glass. I should have been here. I failed her. You couldn't have known, Clara said gently. A man is supposed to protect his family, he said, the words raw with self-loathing. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it was bottomless. The laudanum on the list. It's not for my mother. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It's for me, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. To get through the nights, to keep the memories at bay. He gestured with his glass toward the locked room. That was her room. Our room. I haven't been inside since the day she died. I can't. Clara stared at him, but she had heard him crying in that room just the day before. He was lying. But why? What was he so desperately trying to hide about his wife's death? Before she could press him, he stood up, the moment of vulnerability gone, the hard mask back in place. Thank you for the music, he said stiffly. Good night, Mrs. Sullivan. Clara, she said impulsively. Please call me Clara. He paused at the door. Good night, Clara, he said, and was gone. Later, lying in her bed, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Ethan's story was heartbreaking, but it was also full of holes. He said he couldn't go in the room, but she'd heard him crying there. He said he and Sarah had lost their baby. But as Clara's hand brushed under the edge of her bed to pull the quilt tighter, her fingers touched something small and hard. She pulled it out. It was a small carved wooden bird, smoothed by the touch of a child's hands. It wasn't maize. She had never seen it before. It was the kind of simple toy a farmer like Ethan might carve for his own child. But Ethan's child was dead. So who did this toy belong to? And how did it get under her bed, in a room that had supposedly been empty for years? A terrifying possibility began to form in her mind. A possibility so monstrous she could hardly dare to think it. What if Ethan's child hadn't died? What if the crying she heard wasn't Ethan's grief at all? What if someone else was in that locked room? The next week passed in a tense, fragile peace. Fletcher didn't reappear. Josiah didn't send word. It was a false calm, the quiet before a storm, and everyone knew it. Clara found herself watching Ethan constantly, trying to piece together the puzzle he presented. He was kind to May, even carving her a small wooden horse to go with the mysterious bird. He was respectful to Clara, their late-night conversations in the parlor becoming a regular occurrence. He was slowly, cautiously, letting her in. But the locked room remained a forbidden territory, a secret at the heart of the house. One afternoon, a fierce spring storm rolled in, turning the prairie dark. A creek in the north pasture flooded, stranding a dozen cattle on a small rise of land. "I need help," Ethan said, bursting into the kitchen, soaked and grim. "The water's rising fast." Eleanor was too frail. It had to be Clara. He saddled 2 horses and they rode out into the tempest. The work was hard and dangerous, guiding terrified animals through rising, muddy water. But as they worked together, a strange sense of partnership formed between them. They moved as a team, anticipating each other's actions, fighting the storm as one. By the time the last animal was safe, they were both exhausted, soaked to the bone, but exhilarated. Back in the barn, as Ethan helped her dismount, his hands strong and steady at her waist, they stood for a moment, close in the hay-scented dimness. "You have good instincts," he said, his voice low. Raindrops clung to his eyelashes. The distance that had been between them seemed to dissolve in that moment. He leaned in slightly and Clara felt her breath catch. But just as he was about to kiss her, a loud crash of thunder shook the barn, and a section of the old hayloft roof, weakened by the rain, gave way. A heavy wooden beam plunged down, heading straight for Clara. "Look out!" Ethan yelled. He shoved her clear, taking the full, glancing blow of the beam on his own shoulder. He cried out in pain and collapsed to the straw-covered floor. "Ethan!" Clara screamed, rushing to his side. He was conscious, but his face was white with pain, his left arm hanging at an unnatural angle. His shoulder was clearly dislocated, possibly broken. It's all right," he gritted out through clenched teeth. "Help me up." With Clara's help, he staggered back to the house, leaning heavily on her. As she helped him out of his wet shirt, he hissed in pain. His shoulder was a mess of bruising, already swelling. But as the shirt came off, Clara saw something that made her forget all about his injury. It was a scar, on his right shoulder blade, a flower with 5 petals, the exact same mark as Eleanor's, as her own mother's. Clara stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The lavender circle was a network for women. It was a secret sisterhood. What was its mark doing on Ethan Thornfield? "What? What is that?" she whispered, her finger hovering over the scar. Ethan's face was a mask of pain, but a different kind of pain flickered in his eyes now. The pain of a long-held secret being exposed. "It's a promise," he said, his voice raspy. "A promise I made to Sarah." He looked at Clara, his gaze intense, and the final shocking pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "Sarah wasn't just my wife," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She was part of the circle. This farm. It wasn't just my mother's sanctuary. It was hers, too. She was the one who ran it." Clara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. The entire story she'd been told was a lie. Eleanor wasn't in charge. Sarah had been. "But she died," Clara stammered. Ethan's eyes squeezed shut for a moment. "That's what everyone thinks. It's what I needed them to think. He took a ragged breath. Sarah isn't dead, Clara. Clara just stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was impossible. It couldn't be true. Then where is she? She whispered. Ethan turned his head, his pained gaze moving down the hallway, toward the west wing, toward the locked room. She's in there, he said, with our son. The world tilted on its axis. Clara stumbled back, catching herself on the kitchen table. It couldn't be. The crying she had heard. It wasn't Ethan's grief. It was Sarah's, the child's toy. It belonged to their son. I don't understand, she breathed. 3 years ago, Ethan began, his voice low and urgent, the story pouring out of him now that the dam had broken. Sarah was helping another woman from the circle, a woman from Philadelphia whose husband was a monster. The husband found out. He worked for Blackwell Shipping, Josiah's company. He came after them, Sarah, the woman, and her infant daughter. They made it here, but he followed them. There was a confrontation. The man had a gun. Ethan's voice broke. He fired. He was aiming for the other woman, but Sarah was pregnant. She threw herself in front of her. The bullet grazed her head. It didn't kill her, but he trailed off, the memory too painful. The trauma sent her into early labor. Our son Jacob was born that night. But Sarah, the injury to her head, it left her damaged, confused, prone to fits of panic and despair. She doesn't always know who I am, who she is. Some days are good, some are very bad. So you faked her death, Clara whispered, the audacity of it taking her breath away. It was the only way to protect her, Ethan said desperately. To protect all of them. The man who shot her got away. If he or Josiah Blackwell ever found out she was alive, they would come back to finish the job. She's a witness. The only one besides the other woman? He looked at Clara, his eyes pleading for her to understand. We buried an empty coffin. I told everyone she and the baby had died. It was the only way to keep them safe, to make the world stop looking for them. The crying room wasn't a shrine to a dead wife. It was a hidden sanctuary for a living one. The lock on the outside wasn't to keep people out. It was to keep a confused and frightened Sarah in, to stop her from wandering out and being discovered. The laudanum wasn't for Ethan's grief. It was to calm Sarah during her worst episodes. And the other woman? Clara asked, her throat tight. The one Sarah saved? She and her daughter are long gone, Ethan said. The circle got them to California. A new life, a new name. No one knows where they are. Suddenly, Josiah's relentless pursuit of Clara made perfect, terrifying sense. He wasn't just after a ledger. He was trying to clean up loose ends. He was hunting for the only other person who knew what happened that night. He was hunting for Clara because he thought she was the witness Sarah had saved. And now she was here, in the very house where the secret lived. Clara looked at Ethan, at his injured shoulder, at the scar that marked him as an ally, at the raw pain and desperation in his eyes. He wasn't a jailer. He was a protector, a man who had given up his life to guard the woman he loved. Without a word, she went to the medicine cabinet. She found bandages, splints, and a bottle of whiskey. She spent the next hour cleaning his wound, setting his arm in a sling, forcing him to drink the whiskey for the pain. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The secrets were out, laid bare between them in the quiet kitchen. When she was done, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude that went deeper than words. Thank you, he whispered. In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't just understanding. It was a profound recognition of a shared burden. Both of them were trapped, haunted by the same man, bound by the same secrets. Let me see her, Clara said softly. He hesitated for only a second, then nodded. He took a key from a hidden nook by the fireplace and led her down the cold, dusty hallway to the west wing. He unlocked the heavy door. The room inside was not a prison. It was a world. The windows were barred, but the walls were painted with bright murals of fields and flowers. Books and toys were scattered about. And sitting in a rocking chair, humming a soft lullaby to a small, sleeping boy with Ethan's dark hair was a woman with a distant, haunted look in her eyes. She looked up as they entered, and a flicker of recognition of the old Sarah sparked in her gaze. "Ethan," she whispered. Her eyes moved to Clara, and she smiled a sweet, sad smile. "You must be the new angel," she said, her voice like wind chimes. "Margaret sent you, didn't she? To help with the new arrivals." She thought Clara was another member of the circle, another woman seeking refuge. Her mind was trapped in the past, forever reliving the last day she was truly herself. Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. This was the ghost that haunted Thornfield Farm. Not a ghost of the dead, but a ghost of the living. She looked from Sarah's broken mind to the sleeping child in her arms, to Ethan standing guard in the doorway, his arm in a sling, his face a roadmap of grief and love and fierce determination. She had come here seeking sanctuary, but she had found something else entirely. A secret war, a hidden family, and a love story more tragic and beautiful than she could have ever imagined. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that her running was over. She couldn't leave these people. She was a part of their story now. And Josiah Blackwell wasn't just her enemy anymore. He was theirs, and they were going to fight him together. The revelation changed everything. The farmhouse was no longer a place of suspicion, but a fortress. Clara, Ethan, and Eleanor formed a silent, determined council of war. Clara's days were now spent not just caring for Eleanor, but helping with Sarah and little Jacob, who was a bright, curious 3-year-old who had never been outside the walls of his hidden world. Clara's presence seemed to soothe Sarah. They would sit for hours, talking as if they were old friends in the circle, Clara playing along, gathering more details of the night that had shattered so many lives. Ethan watched them, a new, fragile hope dawning in his eyes. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't alone in his secret. The bond between Clara and Ethan deepened, forged in shared purpose and the quiet intimacy of their strange new life. The unspoken attraction that had simmered between them grew into a profound, complicated affection. They were two broken people finding solace in each other, but their reality was a tangled web. He was a married man, in love with the ghost of his wife, and she was a fugitive. One evening as they sat on the porch after the rest of the house was asleep, Ethan made a shocking proposal. "We should get married," he said, not looking at her, his voice low and steady. Clara stared at him. "Ethan, you have a wife." "I have a wife in that room?" he said, his voice heavy. "But I don't have one in the world. Sarah would want me to live. She would want Jacob to be safe." He finally turned to her, his eyes pleading. "It's a strategy, Clara, a way to protect all of us. If you are Mrs. Ethan Thornfield, it gives you legal standing. It makes it harder for Josiah to make any claims on you or May. It anchors you to this land, to this community. It's a shield." It was a practical, loveless proposal, a marriage of convenience. But as Clara looked at him, at this good, honorable man who had sacrificed everything, she knew there was more to it. It was also a way for him to reach for a life he thought he had lost forever. "Josiah will see the announcement," she whispered. "It will bring him here." "Let him come," Ethan said, a note of steel in his voice. "We're done hiding. It's time to set a trap." Eleanor, using the full power of the Lavender Circle, began to move their pieces into place. Letters were dispatched. Telegrams were sent. Friends in high places were called upon. They weren't just waiting for Josiah anymore. They were summoning him. The wedding announcement appeared in the Oakage Gazette. It was a public declaration of war. 3 days before the wedding, just as Eleanor predicted, Josiah Blackwell arrived. He came not to the farm, but to the sheriff's office in town, spinning his tale of a murderous sister-in-law. But the town, already primed by Harriet Jenkins, met him with cold suspicion. Frustrated, he hired a carriage and came to the farm himself. Clara met him on the porch with Ethan, his arm still in a sling, standing right beside her. "Clara," Josiah said, his smile a cold, predatory thing, "you've led me on quite a chase. It's time to come home and to return what you stole." "I stole nothing," Clara said, her voice steady. "Don't lie to me, Clara. The ledger, Thomas's secret ledger, I know you have it." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. Josiah's eyes narrowed. Then you're of no use to me. He took a step forward. But the child is. May is my blood, my brother's only heir. I'm taking her with me. No, Ethan said, stepping in front of Clara. You're not taking anyone. Josiah laughed. And who are you? The grieving widower? I know all about your dead wife, Thornfield. A tragic story, but it doesn't give you any claim here. And that's when the front door opened. Eleanor sat in her wheelchair, a rifle laid across her lap. But she wasn't alone. Standing behind her, pale and trembling but resolute, was Sarah. Her eyes were lucid and clear, the fog of her confusion burned away by pure, focused rage. Josiah froze, his face draining of all color. He stared at Sarah as if he'd seen a ghost. You, he stammered, you're supposed to be dead. I'm not, Sarah said, her voice stronger than Clara had ever heard it. No thanks to the man you sent to kill me. Josiah stumbled back, his carefully constructed world collapsing. I don't know what you mean. You sent him to kill us, Sarah continued, taking a shaky step onto the porch. To silence us. Because you knew I could testify that he murdered my friend. The woman I was trying to save. Her eyes found Clara's. He didn't just abuse her, Clara. He killed her. And you hired my husband to get rid of the body. You thought you were silencing a witness, but you created two more. It was a bluff. A brilliant, stunning bluff. Sarah didn't know for sure that Josiah had killed the woman, but Josiah didn't know that. He stared at them, cornered and exposed. His gaze darted from Sarah to Ethan to Clara. He was outnumbered. This is insane, he hissed. You have no proof. Don't we? A new voice said. Sheriff Haynes and two deputies stepped out from the side of the house, their guns drawn. We got a telegram this morning, Mr. Blackwell, from a U.S. Marshal in Philadelphia. Seems they finally found the body of that woman who went missing 3 years ago. And they also found a certain shipping company's ledger hidden in the floorboards of her old apartment. Clara stared at the sheriff. The ledger. It was real. And her friend had hidden it before she was killed. Josiah Blackwell was finished. All the color drained from his face as he saw the trap close around him. He made a desperate move, lunging for Clara, trying to take a hostage. But he never made it. With a speed that defied her age, Eleanor raised the rifle and fired. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot the ground at Josiah's feet, the blast echoing across the prairie, sending him sprawling backward into the mud. The deputies were on him in a second, clapping him in irons. As they dragged him away, a broken, sputtering man, the fight finally over, Clara fell into Ethan's good arm, tears of relief streaming down her face. Sarah collapsed into Eleanor's embrace, the effort of her confrontation having taken all her strength. The war was over. They had won. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect. It wasn't a strategic alliance anymore. It was a celebration of survival, of new beginnings. Sarah, though still fragile, was able to attend, sitting beside Eleanor, a quiet, happy smile on her face as she watched the ceremony. Little Jacob and May acted as ring bearers, walking down the aisle together, hand in hand. As Clara stood opposite Ethan, ready to say her vows, she knew she had found something more than just safety. She had found a family born not of blood, but of shared struggle and fierce protective love. They were all broken in their own ways, but together they were whole. Ethan's kiss was a promise of a quiet, happy life, built from the ashes of their painful past, a future where the shadows could no longer reach them. They had faced the monster and won. They had found their justice, and out on the vast Nebraska prairie, under the endless blue sky, the Thornfield farm, once a house of secrets and sorrow, was finally truly a home. If you enjoyed this story of survival and hidden secrets, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You never know what long-buried truths we'll uncover next.